I've got lots of offcuts of plywood cluttering up the workshop at the moment in various thicknesses, and I want to do something with them rather than throw them away. And I've come up with the idea of using the side grain or the end grain of these pieces of plywood in a tabletop. Usually people try and hide these plywood edges, but I'm going to try and make a feature of them instead. I want the tabletop to be quite chunky, so I'm going to set the fence of my table saw to 30mm. Before I make any cuts, I want to make sure that one side of each piece is perfectly straight, and I'll do that by holding it up against the table saw fence. This side is nice and straight, so I'll use that side referenced up against the table saw fence when I make the cuts.
I ripped the pieces of plywood that I had into as many 30mm strips as I could get out of them. For some of the pieces I needed to cut across the grain as opposed to with the grain, and for those pieces I applied some masking tape to help prevent tear out.
The shortest piece of plywood that I cut is 600mm, and that seems like a good size for the tabletop, so I'm going to set up a stop block on the motor station and cut all of the pieces to that length. So I've got all of the pieces cut to length, and I've got roughly a 600 by 600 tabletop. Unfortunately, some of these pieces of plywood are painted, so I'm going to pull out the ones that have paint on them, and I'll have to sand those down before I do the glue up. And that's just to ensure that the glue adheres properly to the wood. I'm going to use the belt sander to take off the paint.
I used a couple of large bar clamps and some wood glue to glue up the tabletop.
That is what Party Next Door is singing about.
I tightened the clamps and checked for squareness with a framing square, and then I could scrape off some of the excess glue. To keep the tabletop flat, I clamped on some of the spare strips of plywood and used cling film to prevent these pieces sticking to the tabletop.
If you've got a lot of clamps, you may as well use them. Now I've got the tabletop in a big bar clamp, and the bar clamp is in my vise, so it's nice and stable, so I can now work on this and try and get the surface flat.
I used a hand plane for this and worked diagonally to the grain to try and even everything up.
Right, I think it's pretty flat now. I can't feel any more high points, so I think it's good. You can see that there are a few voids within the plywood and I'll need to fill those. I'm going to mix up some epoxy and some sawdust to fill the holes.
Good. It's coming up on Cap as an extra.
I want to make this fairly thick because I don't want it to seep through to the other side of the tabletop.
Hang on. With Zupa. Are you looking for an...
I used the miter saw to clean up the ends.
With the sides of the tabletop now squared up, it measures 537 millimeters, and I want the table to be square, so I'm going to cut it to 537 millimeters this way also. And it looks like the blade lines right up with the edge of one of the layers of ply, which is a happy accident. With the epoxy filler now dry, I can sand off the excess with an 80 grit paper on the belt sander. I've got some offcuts here from the salvaged hat and coat stands that I've been using a lot recently. These are offcuts from the last tabletop I made, and I'm going to use these offcuts to make a trim for this tabletop.
I ripped these pieces to just over the thickness of the tabletop.
I'm going to use a cabinet scraper to take off the old finish from these pieces of trim. These pieces of trim have a routed channel in them, which I want to keep as a feature for the table, but obviously I won't be able to take that finish off from there with a cabinet scraper, so I'll attack that later with some sandpaper. I want these trim pieces to join at 45-degree miters at the corners, and I've tilted my table saw blade to 45 degrees. I'm first going to cut one end of each piece to 45 degrees. Now I can offer up one of the trim pieces to the side, making sure that the 45-degree angle is flush with the end, and then I can mark up where the next joint will need to be cut.
I glued and clamped the pieces of trim to the tabletop. After 4 or 5 hours, I removed the clamps.
I deliberately left the trim a little bit proud of the surface of the tabletop by about 2 millimeters, and that's so that I can plane it down flush with the rest of the tabletop. I was going to retain the existing channel that's been routed into these pieces, but they look a little uneven since the miter joints have been added, and also sanding them is going to require a bit of effort. So I've decided instead to route out a new channel around the trim, and that should even things up nicely. The router cleaned up most of the old finish on these trim pieces, but not all of it. So what I'm going to do is wrap a pencil in some sandpaper and use that to take off the rest of the finish.
Next, I sanded the top with a 120 grit paper on the orbital sander.
I'm going to use some of this Superior Danish Oil for the first coat of finish. This plywood is really soaking up the oil really quickly, and I guess that's because of the end grain in a lot of these layers of plywood. So I'm just going to keep adding the oil until it stops soaking it up. Okay, I think that's enough oil now. I'm just going to give it 15 minutes to soak in, and then I'll wipe off any excess. I'm going to add some of this Briwax Rustic Pine finish to the tabletop for two reasons. Firstly, it will help to fill any gaps that I might have missed when I applied the filler of epoxy and sawdust. And secondly, because I want the table to better match the furniture in my living room, which already has this wax applied. And this wax will help to bring out the contrast a little bit more in the wood grain and add a bit more definition. Now that the wax has had a good few hours to dry, I'm going to buff it up with a cotton cloth. I'm actually really pleased with how this one's turned out. I think it's going to make for an interesting table.